Welcome to the EcoSend Podcast. Be inspired, educated, and entertained by the world's most ambitious leaders, putting climate at the top of their agenda.
Hi there, welcome to another episode of the EcoSend Podcast. I'm James, your host. Welcome to another episode of the show. And I have a very special guest today. I'm very excited to welcome Osprey. Osprey is the founder and executive director of the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, otherwise known as WECAN. And she's also the author of the award-winning book, The Story Is in Our Bones, How Worldviews and Climate Justice Can Remake a World in Crisis. One of our first award-winning published authors, Osprey, and I am so glad to be talking to you today. So how are you doing? Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really delighted to be here and glad to have this conversation with you. Thank you.
Awesome, Osprey. You are clearly extremely passionate about the planet, about sustainability, about change. Keen to hear a little bit more about what you're up to, but maybe first it would be great to hear about your journey into this world and how have you ended up on this journey, writing books, leading organizations, and doing this incredible work.
Well, I think like a lot of people, we're very concerned about what is happening with our Earth and our planet. And when we look at the climate crisis and environmental degradation, which are really increasing, they're not decreasing at this time, though there are hopeful signs in different arenas. I think it's a really critical time for many of us to roll up our sleeves and do everything we can for our current and future generations. And that's what really brings me to this work. A little bit of my background, I was really fortunate to grow up in a very small town in Northern California along the Mendocino coast. And one of the significant things about living in that area are the big, old, ancient redwood trees. I don't know if people from the UK know so much about that, but they're the largest trees in the world. They're really magnificent. Wow. And they were very important to me in my youth. And I also learned about a lot of the logging operations that were going on to destroy the forests. And when I saw my first clear-cut forest where they just decimate an entire area, it really shocked me. Yeah. And in some ways that began my journey because in my youth, it was very confronting to think, why were we as humans destroying so much beauty? It was hard for me to wrap my mind around that. And so, of course, my analysis and how I thought about these things changed over time. But that's one of the first things that really seeded my desire to understand how are humans living on Earth and are we doing this in a healthy and equitable manner?
Yeah, wow. Well, it's incredible to turn something so sad and frustrating and perhaps, depressing into so much change that you've been creating. And it's fascinating to hear how that has caused so much for you in your life. I guess it'd be great to understand then. So fast forwarding to now, you run this organization called WECAN. Tell us more about that because, I'm sure many people haven't come across this.
Yeah, well, I became very interested in the climate crisis many years ago, but, sort of a teeing off point when the Obama administration came in to office, and there was a big climate talks that happen every year, the annual climate talks where governments all over the world meet through the United Nations to discuss what we're going to do around climate. And the year that Obama came into office, many of us had a lot of hopes that there would be a transformation in how governments were discussing climate. And to make a long story short, there was not the bold transformative policies that came out of that negotiation. And it was right about then that I realized, I wanted to stop everything I was doing to get engaged in this movement to really transform our trajectory around climate. And I did a lot of research and I found that there's a very instrumental nexus between women's leadership and climate solutions. That was really an untold story, but very impactful. And to not have it be vague, I'll just give like one stat and then people can go to our website and we've done all this research, but just one that's really poignant is there's a really powerful study that shows with just a 1 unit increase in something called the Women's Political Empowerment Index, which is an index that's done all over the world to see how much agency women have in their societies. Do they have political power? What is their economy? What is their mobility? All these different indicators. And with just a 1 unit increase, we see an 11.51% decrease in carbon emission reductions. So that's pretty large.
Wow.
It's hard to find anything that will give you something over 10% carbon emission reductions. And so, in essence, giving women agency provides this shift. And this is also true at the grassroots level. Between 40 and 80% of all household food production in developing countries is done by women. And food
Right.
and the
Yeah.
relationship between climate change is quite related. And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
all this to say that it's just not morally correct that we should have women in leadership roles around climate, because it's important that we have egalitarian societies. It's also important to note that we actually can't get to sustainability without them. And
Yeah.
again, I could go on with these different stats, but from water to food to good policy on climate, we see the tremendous role that women are playing. And so our organization was really founded to uplift women around the world, both at the grassroots level with projects and programs to the highest levels of government and financial institutions to really influence how we're going to move forward.
That's incredible. It's truly eye-opening to hear that as well. I would never have imagined that link before you sharing that and what an incredible organization. So the network, how do you tell me more about how in practical terms you're creating change there and the kind of impact that's having. Like it sounds like a wonderful thing to exist. So what have you seen so far from since starting that?
Well, it's been exciting. I am very honored to wake up every day and be engaged in this work with amazing leaders all over the world. We have impacted climate solutions. We have, the big Paris Climate Agreement. When you look at the history of it, you will see women like Christiana Figueres and many others with her that really pushed the Paris Climate Agreement through, which is critical to the climate negotiations and keeping the 1.5-degree guardrail and many other things that were instituted through that agreement. A lot of that was through women's leadership and negotiations and diplomacy by women. And then, in our own organization, we work with a lot of women at the highest level of government, as I said, but also very exciting what is happening with grassroots leaders, Indigenous, Black and Brown women from all over the world, those impacted first and worst by climate change. Because I think it's really important to understand that when we're talking about gender, we also need to talk about race, because the inequalities that impact women are universal in the sense of our patriarchal societies. But we can't leave out the fact that women of color, Indigenous and Black and Brown women of color, also experience a double discrimination.
Right.
And so it's also really important to listen to their voices. We find that those impacted first and worst by harm also often have the key to the solutions, because they're the ones facing these crises and having to navigate them more than anyone else. And so we've put a lot of time into building relationships on the ground and have projects in many different countries. And I'll give just one example. Right now, we're engaged, we have been for many years, with a really powerful woman leader from the Democratic Republic of Congo, Nima Namadamu. And we have been working on a tree planting project there for many years, reforesting very damaged lands. And at this stage, we are reforesting an area called the Atombe region. And through this reforestation, we're not just healing the land, but also protecting over 1.6 million acres of old growth forest. Because as we grow all these trees, 25% of them are for human use. So people are using them for their food and their housing and cooking and all the things that they need. And so it's pulling the populations off of the old growth forest. And forests are absolutely critical to climate mitigation. And so the fact that we're able to have these new trees be the trees that people are using, leave the old growth alone, and then also reforesting damaged lands. And it's very comprehensive. It's all done by women. It's bringing the women a lot of leadership and power in their communities. And so it's been a really exciting project. Everything from that to a lot of policy briefs that we put out about, what does a feminist economy look like? How do we have care economies? How do we really care for people in this transition that we're in and the energy transition and different types of economic structures. So we're engaged, from the policy level at the climate talks to economic discussions to actually on the groundwork to demonstrate what the role is of women in the leadership roles and why it's so successful and important.
That's incredible. So it really spans the full gamut of how involved you could be in this. That's incredible to hear, and I'm curious, like on the practical level, how do you, for you, Osprey, like over in the US, how do you connect with these projects happening over in parts of the world where are you going part of this? Have you ever visited any of these projects yourself? How does the network work? Like how do these things happen? Because I'm sure many people listening might be very inspired and want to hear more, and maybe want to get stuck in and involved. If yeah.
Yeah, I've of course been to a lot of the projects. We have projects in Ecuador and Brazil and different regions. And I think sometimes it's important to go because of relationship building. And also we're not a funding organization. We are a partnership organization. We have coordinators in these countries who are in our organization. So it's a different model of building deep long-term relationships and really staying with communities all the way through for many, many, many years. So it's a relationship building enterprise and really getting engaged in strategy and, hands-on on the ground work. So that's important, I think, to understand when we're talking about transformation at the community level and community-led solutions. There needs to be deep engagement and deep commitment over a long period of time. So that's a very important component. And we operate in concentric circles for maybe a simpler way to view a model where we have our own staff. That is a very small team that works on a weekly basis, doing all the floor mopping and all the dishes and all those sorts of things that goes on in an organization and beautiful organizing work. And then we have these coordinators in different countries in the world where we work on a very close, intimate basis and are involved on a regular basis with all the daily work that goes on and the monitoring and strategy and fundraising and all of that. And then we have also this very large network that is the larger WECAN network that involves leaders and women and individuals from at least over 60 countries at this point, where we'll do collective work. So it's very, I would say, a horizontal versus a pyramidal structure, which is also part of the transformation we're in. It's like, how do we have leadership that really allows the grassroots and communities to lead from the bottom up instead of the top down? And this is part of the whole change that we're in when we look at environmental degradation and the climate crisis. It didn't just happen. It has come out of systems of supremacy, out of hierarchies, out of colonization, out of these systems of racism and our economic frameworks that really benefit the wealthy elite. And so how do we actually dismantle those systems and transform them into something else? So in our organization, we're certainly not perfect. We're in our own learning curve, but how do we also create these organizations and leadership roles that change how we go about doing things? And so this is why we work so much from the grassroots and from the community level up. But at the same time, we can't pretend we're in this new framework. We're building it. So it's critical that we also have a lot of engagement with government leaders and financial institution leaders so that we can collectively find our way and navigate our way through this middle ground where we can really have everyone benefit. Because right now, we're not all facing the same challenges equally. Not by a long shot. And so we really have to transform our systems. And that's really at the heart of WECAN is systems change. And how do we actually have a systemic change so that we can have a healthy and just world for everyone?
Yeah. Wow, that is incredible. It's incredible how multifaceted the impact of the organization is. It's not just flying in, plant some trees, fly out. it's you're transforming the inclusiveness, the diversity, the cooperation on the ground, and the fundamental systems that play within the organization itself, and the sustainability side of and regenerative side of reforestation like all of these things happening in combination. Do you ever feel like it's where to start? Where like how do you combine all of these things in your head, Osprey, to how do you approach a project when you're trying to achieve so much change? It must be incredibly daunting.
Well, I think about it every day.
Yeah.
It's a mapping process every day because it is, and again, it's a learning curve every time we take on a project. How to look at it holistically, how to
Yeah.
ensure that we have like listening circles with the community. We're working on a project right now where we are looking to reforest an area in Brazil with Indigenous women leaders, and it's a very long process of listening to the women in the community, what and how they see what needs to happen.
Yeah.
We're aware at a technical level, at a scientific level, this one region we're looking at, it's a very key area to reforest of the Brazilian Amazon because it's on the west coast or the western end of Brazil. And what happens is because of the winds that come through, a lot of that deforestation is causing the winds to come through and ruin a lot of topsoil as we go eastward into the Amazon. And so by reforesting this one area, it will have a huge positive impact on the rest of the Amazon by having just reforesting the area, but also creating this forest barrier that used to be there to protect the topsoils. But we can't just go in and just start planting trees. It's not our community. We have not lived there. People have been impacted by colonization and all kinds of hardships. So it's a deep process of being in listening circles. What does the community want? How do the women want to do this? Talking to the leadership, lots of consultation, and co-creating a way to move forward. And also, it's not just about planting the trees. They also want to ensure that their worldviews and ideas about living with nature in harmony get conveyed. Because let's just say tomorrow I could wave a magic wand, which I wish I could, and the climate crisis, I would do that. But it still actually would not change environmental degradation or the systems of patriarchy and colonization, racism and capitalism that exist that have generated these problems. And so while we are dealing with immediate needs, which we should do, and put out immediate fires because people are in harm's way and we're destroying the earth, we need to act immediately. I believe we also need to have this second attention on the systems themselves, as you and I are talking about, because ultimately the systems have to change that brought us into these interlocking crises, or we're just running around putting out fires, and that won't work. We have to do both at the same time.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Like even with your magic wand solving so many problems, we'd still be left with many problems that would just continue in the same way, right? That's quite a profound thought, isn't it? I'm very keen to hear more about the systems change as well. So, and I suspect maybe, I know we talked about you being an award-winning author, Osprey. So your book has come out, and congratulations on that. I could only dream of somehow managing to write a book. Anyone who can write a book is just an absolute hero in my eyes. So congratulations on releasing your book. And
Thank you.
I would love to hear more about what it's about, and if you could give a little bit of an intro to the audience about it, and it'd be great to unpack a lot more about what's in there. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. The book is called "The Story Is in Our Bones," and the subtitle is "How Worldviews and Climate Justice Can Remake a World in Crisis." And the title says a lot, and it's very much a discussion like we're having today. I really wrote the book to open up conversation with my world family, our global community, about systems change. And so there's a lot of stories about the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network and projects we've done, but it's also a very deep dive because I wanted to go upstream and have a conversation about worldviews and how do we actually create a modern society in which we are creating so much destruction, and people are working harder than ever and still trying to put food on the table. How we are creating these systems that we are destroying the planet that sustains us. And it's an approach that has us get into a deep inquiry about our assumptions about life, our assumptions about what's important and not, what's meaningful and what's not meaningful, and how did all this come about? Because I find, sort of like, if you are not feeling well and you go to the doctor, they don't just start giving you pills and things. They have to, hopefully not, they will ask you, where did this illness originate from? And you go through a whole series of diagnosis to actually get to the root cause to then treat. And I would say the book really takes on that map making, if you will, of what are the root causes of these interlocking crises? How did we get here, so that we can really identify that? And when we identify that, then I think we'll be able to much more deeply address those root causes and have a way forward that really is healthy and equitable for the planet and for all of our communities. And so it addresses these issues. But also there's a lot of storytelling and, a weaving of politics and mythology and culture and literature, because also I find how we deliver this information really matters, and that narrative really counts, because it's definitely not a dry climate book by a long shot. There's a memoir, because we also need to activate different parts of ourselves to engage. These are really complex topics, and they're also confronting. I mean, it's an existential question, and people don't want to think about that. And so how do we actually create narratives and storytelling and approaches that allow us to find meaning, but also in a way that we can digest it and sit with it and approach it for ourselves in a way that, it's going to be uncomfortable. I'm not going to lie, it's uncomfortable topics, but in a way where it also feels good, because you're on a healing journey, or you're on a journey of learning where you can take action. And so ultimately the book is very hopeful about what we can do with a lot of, solutions and ideas, but, not stepping over the fact that first we have to understand root causes.
Yeah. It's incredible. My understanding, and I have to admit, I haven't yet had a chance to read the book, Osprey, but my understanding, and from reading some of the fantastic reviews, is that it's not necessarily a book that is going to give you all the answers. There's no book out there that's going to give you all the answers, but it really opens your mind to ways of thinking that will perhaps empower many people to make a lot of change, both in their own lives and in their own communities, in their own areas. And I think that's incredibly powerful. And also what you were saying there about how different people sort of I guess how we do communicate about the challenges we have with climate. It's something that I think a lot of people feel kind of ashamed, or they're sort of shamed into feeling bad about the way the climate is, but to give people hope and aspiration and inspire people, I think is a much more promising way to make change. I'm very excited to dig in. Is there any sort of specific parts of the book where you're most you often find yourself sharing snippets, or any key areas where you're particularly proud of from the book?
Gosh, I've never been asked that question. Let's see.
It's hard to give it the one.
I would just say that I think that there's parts of the book that allow us to deal with these topics we've been discussing. So I won't mention them again, but just to bring up a new point, also how to connect with nature in different ways. Because I think also it's not the solution. And I think you said it really well. I mean, there aren't the solutions. There's a lot of different mosaics of solutions that in an ecosystem might get us through the tiny keyhole that we need to get through right now to a habitable world. So there's a lot of different ways of looking at it. But I think also, just in terms of our well-being, I don't think we can underestimate our relationship with the natural world. Walking in the forest, having a garden, walking along the ocean, looking at the night sky. All of these things can seem really frivolous, or like something maybe you do on your vacation or on a weekend, which I'm glad people do. But I also think that this deep feeling of orphanage from the living world, from the web of life, has been incredibly destructive to us as a species. And how do we really weave, even in our modern societies, even living in cities, how do we reapproach that we're part of this living natural world, this beautiful planet, and make that normalized, if you will, be part of our conversation as something that's important and not something you do on the side, but something that actually is critical to being a human being, but also how we decide things in our policy, how we decide economics, how we decide things. If we're not connected to nature, it's really hard to speak for nature. It's really hard to make decisions that are balanced with nature if we are in feeling, even though it's not true, that we are divorced from nature or separate from nature. And so I think this point cannot be stressed enough, that we have a lot of work to do, most of us who live in urban environments, to reconnect with the natural world so that we can maintain balance and also understand a worldview in which we're living part of an animate living cosmology, if you will. And how do we actually relate to the fact that we're on this living planet, and how does that affect us on a personal basis, a political basis, and everything we do and how we act.
Gosh, yeah, that is so true. It's everything is so interconnected, isn't it? When I know there's various studies, and I just know from my own personal experience, being in nature more, it does connect you with the planet we're on, but it also has this very real impact on yourself as well, and your own ways of thinking, your own calmness, I think. And I think I've noticed it a lot living in London, and there are parts of London you go to where there's literally nothing living in sight. There's just concrete, glass, steel, blocks, and then you can go elsewhere in London and you can be surrounded by trees and greenery and grass. And I know which of those environments are better for my mind, but also better for us to spend a lot more time thinking about. And the consequences of that, I think, for all of us are not to be underestimated.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, I feel like this time is flying by, Osprey. I just wanted to make sure before we get to the end of the show, I also heard from you about Climate Week in New York, because that's something you're going to very soon. And I have to admit, I wasn't aware that this was such a big thing. So across the pond, I've heard of it, but please do tell me more about Climate Week and why it's so important.
Yeah, every year in New York in September, there's the United Nations General Assembly, which happens where all the governments meet and have their General Assembly for the year. But it's also utilized as a moment to prepare for the annual climate talks, which always happen in the end of the year, either in November or December. And so it's a really key moment for climate discussions. And so Climate Week came about, and governments are there, private sector's there, non-governmental organizations are there, advocates, everyone. And there's the whole city is alight with activities that no one could possibly keep track of all of them. It's grown considerably over the years. But it's an important time also for a lot of us who do advocacy work to really make clear what our calls to action are for governments at the upcoming climate negotiations. At WECAN, we'll be hosting several events. One of them is called Women Ending the Era of Fossil Fuels and Implementing Solutions. So talking about actually how do we phase out the fossil fuels, which is a key goal right now. We can't stop the climate crisis without stopping the source, which are fossil fuels, but also how do we implement solutions? We'll also be having a discussion on global economies. And we will also be commenting on something that's happening unique to this year, which is there's the Summit of the Future, which the United Nations is calling for as part of the UN General Assembly. And just to note the struggles that go on when the Summit of the Future was first outlined with their agenda, fossil fuels were not even on the agenda as a discussion. And so a lot of different countries, different leaders from the world, and also a lot of us in civil society pushed back and said, you have got to put fossil fuels on the agenda. How can you talk about the future without talking about fossil fuels and what we're going to do about them? And so, these are the kinds of things where we can have interventions and influence and push governments to work harder and faster to move on the climate crisis and other huge problems that the world faces. So all of these discussions will be going on at Climate Week, and government leaders will be making statements. And yeah, as I say, it's a time to sort of everybody stake their ground for the coming up negotiations. So we're getting ready for that, and we'll be bringing a lot of Indigenous women leaders to speak for themselves. One of the big climate talks that's coming up, not this year in Azerbaijan, but next year in Brazil, is a really pivotal moment. So really excited to see Indigenous women leaders from Brazil coming and sharing their concerns and their plans and their agendas. So I'm looking forward to it. It will be a very busy week, and I know there'll be a lot of announcements that come out, and people can learn what happened through the news cycles. But I wish people were paying a lot more attention to what's happening with climate, because our window is getting very small. And I like to think about hope in a sentence that was shared with me, which is hope is a verb with its sleeves rolled up. And I think that would be, sort of my final note around Climate Week. And thinking about our discussion is like, if we're going to have hope for the future, we all have to engage. And that's what I really want to encourage people to do, is like, there's so much that needs to be done. And it can start at the simplest level of what happens in your own home and recycling, that sort of thing, but also meeting others who are engaged, and doing the things that you're most passionate about always gives you the most energy. And so to focus there. But the main thing is, if we all do something, then there really is hope. If we're on the sidelines, that really decreases our chances. So to me, hope is a verb with its sleeves rolled up.
I love that. What a wonderful quote to finish on. Thank you, Osprey. I think it's been a wonderful discussion. I'm sure many people listening and watching are coming away from this feeling inspired, maybe hopeful, I hope, and hopefully wanting to take some action themselves. Thank you. We will make sure we link to a bunch of things in the show notes, including, of course, your book. And that title again is The Story is in Our Bones. And we'll link to that in the show notes, of course. Osprey, if people want to find you online, your website, I assume, is the best place. Is that right?
Yes, it's www.wecaninternational.org.
Amazing. So we'll make sure we link to all of those in the show notes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me on the show today.
Thank you so much. It's been really a delight talking with you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Osprey. And thank you, everybody, for listening or watching. If you've enjoyed today's show, please do let us know and share it with as many people as you can. It would just be so wonderful for Osprey's story and ideas to be spread far and wide. So thank you for watching and listening, and we'll catch you next time.